When you hear the name Mary I, you probably hear one phrase in your head: Bloody Mary, a queen of fire and fear, a religious fanatic, a zealot, and a failure in comparison to her half-sister Elizabeth I, who of course is known for her golden age. But that version of Mary is a shortcut, and it's not good history. Because before she was queen, Mary was Henry VIII's heir, and a child shaped by triumph, then broken by humiliation and mistreatment. And before the burnings, there was a lifetime of endurance, political intelligence, and a fierce belief in legitimacy, law, faith, and birthright. And she was a woman people rallied behind, a woman men were prepared to fight and die for. So today, this is your beginner's guide to Queen Mary I. We're going to walk through her life in full, from her celebrated birth in 1516 through the collapse of her world in the 1530s, her defiance under King Edward VI, the extraordinary way that she won her crown in 1553, and what she actually tried to do as queen. And yes, of course, we'll talk about the burnings, but in context, not isolated, because Mary deserves more than a caricature. I'm Claire Ridgway, historian and author, and if you enjoy deep dives like this, do make sure that you're subscribed and you've hit that notification bell, because this is part of my Beginner's Guide series, and there are plenty more Tudor lives and turning points coming your way. Right, let's start where Mary's story begins, with celebration. Mary I, daughter of King Henry VIII and his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was born on the 18th of February 1516 at Greenwich Palace. And from the very beginning, Mary mattered. She was not a disappointment in the way that popular culture sometimes suggests. She was celebrated. Bells rang, guns fired, Te Deums were sung. After 3 stillbirths and the loss of a son in early infancy, Catherine of Aragon had given Henry VIII a healthy living child, and for the first time one who survived beyond infancy. And crucially, at this point, Mary was Henry VIII's heir. There was no son, no Prince of Wales waiting in the wings. For the first decade of her life, Mary was not a consolation prize, she was the future. And Henry treated her accordingly. She was educated to rule, fluent in Latin, skilled in music, trained in courtly ceremony, and praised for her intelligence and seriousness. Ambassadors commented on her dignity even as a child, and Erasmus himself admired her learning. Mary grew up in a world where her legitimacy was unquestioned and constantly reinforced. She sat beside her mother at court. She received homage. She was addressed as the princess. And perhaps most importantly, she was deeply emotionally close to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine wasn't only her mother, she was her moral compass. From her, Mary absorbed an unshakable sense of duty, piety, and identity. Catherine taught her that queenship was service, that faith was non-negotiable, and that legitimacy came from God as much as from law. This mattered because when everything else was stripped away, her title and even her legitimacy, those beliefs remained. By the mid-1520s, Mary Tudor was no longer just the king's daughter. She'd become a political solution. In 1525, Henry VIII took a decisive step. He sent his 9-year-old daughter away from court and established her at Ludlow, on the edge of the Welsh Marches, the traditional seat of the heir to the throne. There, Mary was given her own household and treated in practice, if not in title, as Princess of Wales. The title itself was never formally granted. Henry still hoped desperately for a legitimate son, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Mary presided over councils, she received visitors, she issued commands in her father's name. She learnt what it meant not just to be royal, but to govern. At this point, Mary was being presented as England's future. Foreign ambassadors watched her closely. Marriage negotiations were discussed seriously, with potential alliances ranging from France to the Holy Roman Empire. For a time, it seemed entirely plausible that Mary would become England's first reigning queen, not by accident, but by design. And Mary understood this. She took her role seriously. Observers remarked on her dignity, her solemnity, her seriousness of purpose. She behaved not as a little girl playing at power, but as someone who believed that power had been entrusted to her by God and by birth. And this matters because it's here in these years, as her father's only legitimate heir, as the granddaughter of the infamous Isabella of Castile, that Mary's sense of legitimacy becomes inseparable from her identity. She wasn't simply Henry's daughter, she was the rightful heir. She was being trained to rule. But while Mary's position looked secure on the surface, cracks were already beginning to form beneath it. Henry's hopes for a male heir had not faded, his frustration had deepened, and increasingly his attention and his affections were drifting elsewhere. While Mary governed in the marches, her father was beginning to question the very marriage that had produced her. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, the ground beneath Mary's feet began to shift. And what makes this period so poignant is that Mary had done nothing wrong. She'd fulfilled her role, she'd obeyed, she'd learnt, she'd embodied the future that Henry VIII himself had shaped for her. And yet the future she was being prepared for was already being dismantled, and without her knowledge. Because in Henry VIII's world, legitimacy was conditional. And the moment Mary ceased to serve his dynastic needs, everything that she'd been taught to believe about herself was about to be challenged. If the years at Ludlow taught Mary that she was England's future, the years that followed taught her something far harsher, that her future could be erased, that she could go from being her father's pearl of the world, as he once referred to her, to fearing for her life. By the early 1530s, Henry VIII was no longer merely frustrated by his lack of a male heir, he was obsessed by it. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon, once celebrated, was now reinterpreted as a mistake, as a sin. And at the heart of that reassessment stood Mary herself. Because if Henry's marriage was invalid, then Mary wasn't a princess at all. Although she could be deemed as having been conceived in good faith, Henry VIII wanted his children with his new wife to be his only legitimate heirs. So Mary became a bastard. For Mary, this was an assault on her very identity. She was stripped of her title and no longer referred to as Princess Mary, but downgraded to Lady Mary. She was removed from her own household and placed in the service of her baby half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Queen Anne Boleyn, a humiliation that was both deliberate and deeply symbolic. And perhaps most devastating of all, she was separated from her mother. Mary and Catherine of Aragon were forbidden from seeing one another. They were allowed to exchange letters only rarely, and even those were sometimes intercepted. Catherine, once queen, was banished from court and pushed into isolation and declining health. Mary was left frightened, angry, and powerless, watching the foundations of her world collapse from a distance. At the same time, pressure mounted for Mary to submit. She was ordered to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been unlawful. She was expected to accept the royal supremacy and recognise her father as head of the church in England, and she was repeatedly warned that refusal would have consequences. Mary refused. Not loudly, not dramatically, but stubbornly, consistently, and at great personal cost. For Mary, to submit wasn't just to obey her father, it was to declare her mother a liar, her own birth a mistake, and her faith a sham. Catherine of Aragon had taught her that legitimacy and truth were bound up with conscience. To deny one was to deny the other. So Mary held her ground. But the result was years of fear, illness, and isolation. At times she was seriously unwell, both physically and mentally. She lived with the constant knowledge that defiance could lead to imprisonment or worse. Others had fallen swiftly in Henry VIII's court for far less. And this wasn't teenage petulance or religious obstinacy. This was survival under sustained psychological pressure. Eventually, after Catherine's death in 1536, Mary did what she'd resisted for years. She signed a carefully worded submission, acknowledging her father's authority. And she only did this following persuasion from the imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis, who was concerned for her safety. Mary had been bullied mercilessly by her father's counsellors, one of whom had told her, were she his or any other man's daughter, he would beat her to death or strike her head against the wall until he made it as soft as a boiled apple. And he also called her a traitress who would be punished as such, i.e., that she should be executed. Chapuis explained in a letter to the emperor that he was able to persuade Mary to submit to her father's wishes, saying, "My opinion was that she ought to obey her father's commands, assuring her at the same time that such was your majesty's advice and wish, that in order to save her own life, on which the tranquillity of this kingdom and the reform of the many great disorders and abuses by which it is troubled entirely depended, that it was necessary that she should make all manner of sacrifices." Chapuis went on to describe how Mary followed his advice and signed the submission to her father without reading it. But doing so had a huge impact on Mary, and she fell suddenly into a state of despondency and sorrow. Chapuis comforted her, though, by explaining that the Pope would not hold it against her and that he would highly approve of it under the circumstances. It wasn't a full ideological surrender, but it was enough to restore Mary to favour. The damage, however, was done. Mary had learnt that titles could be revoked, that affection was conditional, that faith could be punished, and that survival sometimes required endurance rather than resistance. And this is the Mary who emerges from the 1530s, not softened, not reconciled, but hardened. And when she later insists as queen on obedience, conformity and religious unity, she is not inventing those values out of nowhere. She is enforcing the only worldview that ever allowed her to survive. After years of resistance, fear and isolation, Mary's submission in 1536 brought her back into her father's orbit. She was restored to court life, allowed to re-enter royal households, and permitted once again to exist publicly as the king's daughter, although not princess. But this wasn't reconciliation. Mary was back in favour, not back in safety. She remained legally illegitimate. She had no guaranteed place in the succession, and she lived in a court where favour could vanish overnight, as she'd learnt all too well. But under these conditions, Mary adapted. She learnt caution, she learnt restraint, and she learnt that survival at Henry VIII's court depended not on truth, but on timing. And outwardly, she conformed. She attended court functions. She behaved with dignity and obedience. She didn't provoke. She didn't challenge openly. But inwardly, she didn't abandon the beliefs that had sustained her through the 1530s. Her Catholic faith remained intact. It was the one thing that she could rely on. Mary continued to hear Mass privately whenever she could. She maintained contact with conservative courtiers and with members of the imperial network loyal to her mother's family. And although she no longer resisted publicly, she never accepted the religious settlement in her heart. Henry, for his part, remained deeply ambivalent about her. At times he showed affection, at others irritation. Mary was useful as a dynastic asset, particularly when Henry's marriage prospects required flexibility. But she was also a living reminder of a past that he wished to erase. Crucially, Henry never fully restored her status. Mary was included in the 1544 Act of Succession, which placed her and Elizabeth back in line to inherit the throne after Edward. But legitimacy was not restored. The law allowed her to rule without acknowledging that she'd ever been wronged. It was a compromise that suited Henry perfectly, and I don't think Henry VIII ever thought that her legitimacy would be an issue. He expected his son to have a long reign and to outlive his daughters. For Mary, her status meant living in permanent uncertainty, and these years shaped her profoundly. She became observant, politically alert, and deeply suspicious of change imposed from above. She learnt how policy could be reversed without warning, how laws could be rewritten to serve power, and how faith, once surrendered, might never be reclaimed. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, Mary was 30 years old. She'd survived 2 decades of instability, humiliation and fear, and she'd outlasted 6 queens. She'd learnt when to bend and when not to, and she'd learnt one final lesson, that endurance, not rebellion, was sometimes the only path to survival. What she couldn't yet know was that her greatest test was still ahead, because the reign that followed, that of her young half-brother Edward VI, would demand not quiet conformity, but open resistance, and this time Mary would not yield. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, the crown passed to his 9-year-old son Edward VI. England now had a boy king, and in practice a government run by Protestant reformers who had very different priorities from Henry. For Mary, this changed everything. Under her father, she'd learnt to survive by keeping her beliefs private, and in fact her father had died a Catholic. But under Edward VI, this policy was no longer possible. Edward's reign marked a decisive shift towards Protestantism. The Mass was dismantled, images were removed from churches, clerical marriage was permitted. The old rhythms of Catholic worship, which had shaped Mary's faith since childhood, were condemned as superstition and idolatry. And Mary was expected to conform, but she didn't. Unlike many others, Mary had something that most English subjects didn't: status, foreign allies, and visibility. As the king's sister and next adult heir, her religious choices could not be quietly ignored. She continued to hear Mass in her household openly and deliberately. When ordered to stop, she refused. When threatened with punishment, this time she stood her ground. This wasn't reckless defiance, it was calculated resistance. Mary knew that her position gave her a narrow margin of protection. She also knew it might not last. Edward himself took a personal interest in the matter. In letters and memoranda, he criticised his sister's stubbornness and urged her to abandon what he saw as error. For Edward, raised in a fervently Protestant environment, Mary's Catholicism wasn't just old-fashioned, it was dangerous. She could be an example to others. For Mary, Edward's reforms were not progress, they were heresy. She saw the destruction of altars, the suppression of the Mass, and the rewriting of doctrine as an attack on the faith that had sustained her through her darkest years. To submit now would mean admitting that everything she'd endured, her mother's suffering, her own humiliation, had been for nothing. So she refused. And she didn't just refuse and lead a quiet life. In March 1551, Mary rode through London with 50 knights and gentlemen before her and 80 gentlemen and ladies behind her, all carrying rosaries. This was an open profession of her Catholic faith. It was outright defiance of her half-brother's religious legislation. The situation grew increasingly tense. There were moments when Mary's arrest seemed possible. Her household was watched, her servants were interrogated and even imprisoned, and at times she prepared to flee. What saved her was politics. Mary was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and that made her the cousin of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe. Imperial ambassadors intervened repeatedly on her behalf, warning that harm to Mary would not go unanswered. Edward's government was furious, but constrained. Mary, meanwhile, learnt something crucial. She learnt that she still mattered, that popular sympathy still counted, and that her resistance was being watched far beyond England's borders. By the early 1550s, the situation was at breaking point, and Edward became ill in 1552, never properly recovering from a bout of smallpox and measles. His advisors were increasingly anxious, and Mary, Catholic, legitimate in the eyes of many, and stubbornly visible, loomed large as a threat to the Protestant settlement. When Edward died in July 1553, the crisis that followed wasn't sudden, it had been building for years. And Mary was ready. When Edward VI died on the 6th of July 1553, England didn't immediately know it. His death was kept secret while the council prepared for what they knew would be a dangerous transition. But what followed wasn't the story of a dying boy manipulated by ambitious men, nor was it a simple coup. Edward VI had convictions, deep ones. He wasn't a puppet. By 1553, Edward had been raised in a thoroughly reformed Protestant environment. He believed sincerely that England's salvation depended upon continuing the Reformation. To him, religion wasn't politics, it was truth. And he was convinced that his half-sister Mary would undo everything that he and his councillors had built. So in his dying days, Edward drafted his device for the succession. He didn't merely sign something placed before him. He revised it, he altered it, he argued over it. He insisted on it being legally enacted. When judges hesitated, he reminded them of their duty to obey the king. This was Edward's decision. He excluded Mary and Elizabeth not only on religious grounds, but on legal ones, pointing to their illegitimacy and to the concept of their half-blood. He sought to secure the succession through the Protestant line of Frances Brandon, Frances Grey, eventually naming Lady Jane Grey and her male heirs. It was a bold, radical act, but it was also fragile, because Edward's will, however determined, collided with statute law and with the memory of Henry VIII's carefully constructed succession settlement. And Mary understood that collision perfectly. Mary wasn't caught unaware. She'd lived through humiliation, illegitimacy, coercion, and surveillance. And she knew how precarious her position was. She also knew how powerful it could be. When she received word that Edward was dying, she didn't hesitate. She left Hunsdon under the pretext of visiting her physician and rode east towards East Anglia. This wasn't panic, it was calculation. And East Anglia wasn't random. It was an area where she had estates, where conservative religion still had roots, where loyalty to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, lingered, where powerful families could be mobilised quickly. After news of her half-brother's death from Kenninghall and from Framlingham Castle, Mary began issuing letters. Not pleas, but commands. She didn't declare herself queen as a rebel. She declared herself queen as Edward VI's lawful heir under the Act of Succession enacted by her father. That distinction mattered enormously. Mary framed her claim in terms of law, her father's will, divine order and continuity. And people responded, not because they were all Catholic zealots, but because legitimacy still mattered in Tudor England, because Henry VIII's settlement still carried weight, because replacing a named heir with a young woman whose claim rested on a late controversial device felt dangerous. Meanwhile, in London, Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen. Queen Jane. And Jane herself appears to have understood the fragility of the situation. She reportedly declared that the crown was not hers by right, but she accepted it as a duty and her destiny once persuaded of Edward's intent. And this was not a melodrama of villains and victims, it was a constitutional crisis. But Mary had three enormous advantages. She acted immediately, she invoked statute law, and she attracted visible support. She was known, Jane wasn't. Noblemen, gentry, towns, and even elements of the royal fleet declared for her. The speed of that support unsettled the council in London, and then something critical happened. The Privy Council, pragmatic, cautious, politically self-preserving, shifted. On the 19th of July 1553, the same council that had proclaimed Jane now proclaimed Mary. No battle was fought, no foreign army landed, no civil war erupted. Mary had won through legitimacy and momentum. This was unprecedented. For the first time in English history, a woman had successfully claimed the crown in her own right, not as consort, not as regent, but as sovereign. And that victory shaped everything that followed. Mary had survived her father's rejection, her brother's religious assault on her faith, and a succession crisis designed to exclude her. And now she ruled in her own right, supported by her people. But victory in July 1553 didn't solve England's problems. It exposed them. England was religiously divided. The council was divided. Foreign policy was delicate. The question of marriage loomed. She'd secured the crown. Now she had to secure the future. When Mary I took the throne, she didn't see herself as introducing something new. She saw herself as restoring what had been unlawfully altered. In Mary's mind, England hadn't progressed over the previous 20 years, it had deviated. The break with Rome wasn't reform, it was rupture in her mind, a fracture in the religious and legal continuity of the realm. And Mary was not improvising. She'd spent 2 decades defending her legitimacy, first as princess, then as heir. She understood statute law. She understood precedent. She understood that her own title had been confirmed by Parliament in Henry VIII's Third Act of Succession. So from the beginning, her approach was procedural. She didn't immediately reinstate papal supremacy. She didn't immediately revive heresy laws. She didn't immediately purge her council. Instead, she worked through Parliament. The first Parliament of her reign repealed Edwardian religious legislation. It restored the Mass. It re-established the form of worship familiar to most of the population. But it didn't yet restore papal authority, and it didn't yet revive the heresy laws. Mary understood that legal consent was not optional. She was a queen regnant, something England had never seen before. Her authority, though legitimate, was vulnerable to perception, and everything had to be done in order. And alongside religion, her government addressed naval reform, continuing dockyard investment begun under Henry and Edward, administrative organisation, financial management and revenue review. And these reforms are rarely discussed because they're not dramatic, but they mattered. And Elizabeth would inherit institutions strengthened during Mary's reign. Mary wasn't governing emotionally, she was governing structurally. Mary was 37 when she became queen, and she'd never married. She'd spent her life watching how fragile succession could be, and she knew instability personally. If she died without a Catholic heir, England would revert to Elizabeth, and Protestant reform would resume. So marriage wasn't romantic, it was a political necessity. Mary considered options carefully. A purely English match risked factionalism. A European alliance risked xenophobia. But she chose Philip of Spain for strategic reasons. He was Catholic. He represented Habsburg strength. He provided international security, and he reinforced England's place within Catholic Europe. But there was strong opposition to the idea of Mary marrying Philip. There was fear of foreign influence and Spanish dominance, factional ambition, and also Protestant anxiety. Thomas Wyatt the Younger's rebellion in early 1554 was serious. It was organised, elite-led resistance centred largely in Kent. And Mary's response wasn't hysterical, it was masterful. On the 1st of February 1554, with Wyatt advancing towards London, Mary went in person to Guildhall. She didn't hide behind councillors. She didn't issue proclamations from safety. She addressed the citizens of London in person. Her speech, recorded by both John Proctor and John Fox, was constitutionally powerful and rousing. She framed herself as England's lawful queen, married already to the realm, defender of London, and willing to shed her own blood before abandoning her people. This was political theatre, but also heartfelt, and it worked. London rallied. Wyatt was blocked at Ludgate. The rebellion collapsed. The regime survived. This wasn't luck, it was leadership. And it demonstrated something critical. Mary could command loyalty, just as she'd done in July 1553. After Wyatt's rebellion, Mary constructed a tight marriage treaty to protect English sovereignty. In April 1554, the Act for the Marriage of Queen Mary to Philip of Spain, or Queen Mary's Marriage Act, was passed. According to this legislation, Philip was only King of England and Ireland as long as he was married to Mary, and he would lose those titles and everything that came with them on her death. Mary was the one that had the main authority, and there were measures to stop him appointing foreigners to offices and such like. The Act protected Mary and England's rights and removed the risk of England becoming just another Habsburg territory. Mary didn't hand England to Spain, she negotiated. And only after her marriage to Philip in July 1554 did Mary move to complete what she saw as unfinished restoration. In November 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole formally reconciled England to Rome. This too was done through Parliament, and only after parliamentary consent were the heresy laws revived. And that chronology matters. Mary didn't begin her reign with burnings. She began it with repeal, reconciliation and restoration through statute. The burnings began in 1555, and between 1555 and 1558, approximately 280 people were executed for heresy. That is a stark number, and it cannot be ignored or condoned. Mary bears responsibility as sovereign. But context matters. Heresy had been a capital crime under medieval law. Henry VIII had executed both Catholics and Protestants. Edward VI's regime imprisoned and deprived Catholics, and I suspect he would have gone on to persecute Catholics in droves, as would Queen Jane, I'm sure. And Elizabeth would later execute Catholic priests and those who harboured them. Persecution wasn't new. What made Mary's policy distinct was scale and visibility and motivation. Mary believed Protestantism endangered souls, not metaphorically, literally. For her, religious unity wasn't preference, it was salvation. She believed that tolerating heresy would condemn England spiritually. This heresy invading the land could lead to people going to hell, in her view. And a monarch who failed to defend the true faith and to look after her people's souls would answer before God. That conviction shaped her actions. The tragedy is that the policy backfired. Instead of restoring unity, the burnings created martyrs. They hardened Protestant identity. They furnished John Fox with powerful narratives that would define Mary's memory for centuries. And because her reign was short and followed by a Protestant successor, her religious policy became the defining lens through which everything else was viewed. Bloody Mary wasn't a contemporary nickname, it was a Protestant memory. Moving on to her final years, Mary had suffered health problems such as menstrual irregularity and depressive episodes since adolescence, and chronic headaches, visual problems, and phantom pregnancies plagued her final years. Her two believed pregnancies in 1554, 1555 and 1557, 1558 were emotionally devastating. And they weren't theatrical delusions. Ambassadors recorded physical symptoms consistent with pregnancy: milk secretion, abdominal swelling, missed periods. Whether pseudocyesis or a pituitary tumour as suggested by Milo Keynes, her symptoms were real. It's hard to imagine what it was like for Mary to believe that she was pregnant, but then for no baby to appear. By autumn 1558, influenza was sweeping London. Mary became gravely ill in October, and on the 17th of November 1558, she died aged 42, likely of influenza, compounded by underlying health conditions. Her Archbishop of Canterbury and trusted advisor, Cardinal Reginald Pole, died the same day. It was a symbolic end to her restoration project. Mary's reign lasted just 5 years. She left no heir. She left no Catholic settlement that endured. She left no successor who would defend her memory. Instead, her half-sister Elizabeth inherited the throne. And Elizabeth's regime needed contrast. Mary became the necessary foil. Catholic versus Protestant. Failure versus Golden Age. Blood versus stability. Fox's Book of Martyrs ensured that her burnings would never be forgotten. Her naval reform, her administrative work, her parliamentary strategy, her political intelligence in 1553 and 1554, all overshadowed. History is often written by the victorious, but it's remembered through narrative convenience. Mary fit the story Protestant England needed. But Mary was not a monster. She was not hysterical. She was not manipulated. She was a legally minded, politically aware, devout monarch who believed she'd been called by birth, by law, and by God to restore what had been broken. She'd survived humiliation, illegitimacy, coercion, surveillance, and a succession crisis designed to erase her. And when the moment came, she didn't flee England. And England chose her. And she was willing to fight for her throne. Mary governed through Parliament. She negotiated her marriage on constitutional terms. She strengthened institutions that Elizabeth would inherit, and she proved that a woman could rule in her own right. Did she fail in the long term? Yes. Did she authorise a policy that caused real suffering? Yes. But she wasn't uniquely cruel, and she wasn't simply Bloody Mary. She was a Tudor shaped by fear, faith, survival, and conviction. And perhaps the real tragedy of Mary's reign is not that she tried to restore Catholic England, it's that history remembers her only for the flames and not for her fortitude. There's far more to her than the heresy burnings. And if you want to know more about the real Mary I, I recommend the books by Linda Porter, Anna Whitelock and Melita Thomas, as well as the research of Joanna Strong and Peter Stifel. And if you've enjoyed this beginner's guide and you'd like more deep dive Tudor history, don't forget to like, subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think of Queen Mary I.